The Cleveland Browns already made their quarterback decision, they just haven't admitted it yet. Because while everyone debates Deshaun Watson and hypes Shedeur Sanders, one name has quietly disappeared, and that silence might reveal everything the team is trying to hide. Because sometimes, what a team doesn't say tells you more than anything they do. Something strange is happening in Cleveland, and almost nobody is talking about it. Not because there isn't a story, but because one name has quietly disappeared from it. And that name is Dillon Gabriel. Not long ago, Gabriel wasn't just another quarterback in the room. He was seen as a legitimate piece of the Cleveland Browns' future, a developmental option, a player with upside, someone who could grow into a role if things broke the right way. There was curiosity around him. There were conversations about his fit. There was at least some belief that he could matter. And now, nothing. No real analysis of his progress, no detailed breakdowns from insiders, no strong endorsements from coaches, no real push from the organization to keep his name in the conversation. Just silence. And in the NFL, silence like that doesn't happen by accident. This is a league where every quarterback, even third stringers, gets discussed, every throw in practice gets clipped, every minor update turns into a headline, especially during the offseason when there's time to analyze everything. So when a quarterback who was once part of the conversation suddenly isn't mentioned at all, it stands out. Because it's not normal. Think about it. If Gabriel were truly competing for a meaningful role, you would hear about it. You'd hear coaches talking about his development. You'd hear reporters breaking down his reps. You'd see debates about where he fits in the depth chart. But that's not what's happening. Instead, his name barely comes up, and when it does, it feels surface level. Quick mentions, generic comments, nothing with real weight behind it. And that kind of shift doesn't just happen randomly. It happens when priorities change. Because NFL teams don't accidentally forget about quarterbacks they believe in. They don't just stop talking about players who are part of their plans. If anything, they do the opposite. They amplify those players. They build confidence around them. They make sure everyone knows those names matter. So when the opposite happens, when a name starts fading instead of growing, it sends a message. A quiet one, but a clear one. And the message here, it's not that Dillon Gabriel is being criticized. It's that he's being removed. Not officially, not publicly, but gradually, subtly, in a way that makes it feel natural instead of sudden. And that's what makes this situation so revealing. Because this isn't what it looks like when a player loses a competition. This is what it looks like when a player is no longer part of it. And once you see that, you start to realize this might not be about performance at all. If you really want to understand what's happening, don't look at what the Cleveland Browns are saying. Look at where the attention is going. Because right now, it's not spread evenly, it's not balanced, it's not even pretending to be a three-way conversation. It's focused, very focused. On one side, you have Deshaun Watson. Every update about him gets detailed coverage. His recovery, his contract, his role moving forward. Analysts break it down constantly. Insiders revisit the financial situation. Every small development becomes part of a larger discussion about what the Browns are tied to and what they're trying to get out of that investment. There's weight behind his name. There's urgency in how he's discussed. Because whether it's working or not, he's still central to the situation. Then on the other side, you have Shedeur Sanders. And the energy there feels completely different. It's about upside, potential, future direction. Every conversation around him feels forward-looking, what he could become, how the team might build around him, why his skill set fits where the league is going. There's curiosity. There's excitement. And most importantly, there's momentum. Now compare that to what's happening with Dillon Gabriel. Or more accurately, what's not happening. Because when his name comes up, it doesn't carry the same tone, it doesn't carry the same detail, it doesn't stay in the conversation long enough to matter. It feels like a placeholder. A quick mention, a surface-level acknowledgement, and then almost immediately, the focus shifts back to Watson or Sanders. And when that happens repeatedly, it stops feeling accidental. It starts looking intentional. Because in the NFL, attention is a signal. Teams don't just talk randomly, They don't highlight players without purpose. If a quarterback is truly part of the plan, that belief shows up everywhere: press conferences, insider reports, media discussions. It gets reinforced, repeated, expanded on. But when a player isn't part of that vision, the opposite happens. The conversation shrinks, the details disappear, and eventually the name fades. That's exactly what we're seeing here. This isn't about who's performing better in practice. This isn't about one player clearly outplaying another in front of cameras. This is about where the organization is placing its focus and who they're quietly moving away from. Because when two names dominate every discussion, and one name barely survives it, that tells you everything you need to know. And once you recognize that shift, the idea of this being an open competition starts to fall apart completely. Here's the part most people don't want to admit. This was never a real competition. On the surface, the Cleveland Browns framed it exactly how teams always do: multiple quarterbacks, equal opportunity, best player wins. It sounds fair, it sounds competitive, and publicly it works. But behind the scenes, that's rarely how it actually plays out. Because in the NFL, true open competitions are almost non-existent, especially at quarterback. Coaches don't just walk into a season with no idea who they prefer. Front offices don't invest time, money, and resources without already having a direction in mind. There are internal evaluations, private meetings, detailed breakdowns that carry far more weight than anything said in front of a microphone. And those evaluations, they happen long before fans ever hear about a competition. So when you look at what's happening with Dillon Gabriel, it starts to make more sense. Because if this were truly open, you'd see it. You'd hear urgency when coaches talk about his development. You'd get detailed updates about what he's improving. You'd see consistent inclusion in every major conversation about the quarterback room. There would be energy behind his name. There would be belief. But that's not what's happening. Instead, what you're getting is minimal coverage, vague comments, no real push to position him as a serious contender, and most importantly, no sign that the organization is investing in his path forward. That's not how teams treat players they're genuinely evaluating. That's how teams handle players they've already evaluated. And once that internal decision is made, everything else becomes a process. A process of managing the optics. A process of slowly shifting expectations. A process of making the outcome feel natural instead of sudden. Because teams don't like surprises, especially when it comes to important positions like quarterback. They don't want fans reacting to a sudden decision. They want that decision to feel obvious by the time it actually happens. And the easiest way to do that is to control the narrative early. Limit certain names. Elevate others. Guide the conversation without ever saying it directly. That's exactly what this feels like. Because when one quarterback is consistently left out of meaningful discussion, it's not because he's still competing. It's because the competition has already moved past him. And once you accept that, the entire situation looks different. This wasn't about Dillon Gabriel losing a battle. It was about him never being fully in it to begin with. And that raises a much bigger question. If the decision was already made, what pushed the Browns to make it so early? If you're trying to figure out why all of this feels so calculated, you have to start with one thing: the contract. Because everything happening inside the Cleveland Browns right now traces back to Deshaun Watson and the financial reality tied to him. This isn't just a big contract. It's a franchise-defining one. The kind of deal that doesn't just impact one player, it reshapes the entire roster. It dictates decisions, it limits flexibility, and over time, it forces organizations into corners they never planned to be in. And that's exactly where Cleveland is right now. Because every time they restructure Watson's deal, and reports suggest they've done it multiple times, they're not solving the problem. They're delaying it. They're pushing money into the future just to survive the present, creating short-term breathing room while quietly building long-term pressure. In that pressure, it's already showing. Some analysts believe the current structure points toward a breaking point in the next couple of seasons. Others have suggested that by 2026, the financial situation could force a major decision, whether the team is ready or not. Nothing is officially confirmed, but the direction is hard to ignore. And when a franchise reaches that point, the strategy changes. This is no longer about slowly developing multiple quarterbacks and seeing what happens. This is no longer about patience or long-term experiments. This becomes about urgency, clarity, control. Because the Browns don't just need a quarterback, they need to figure out their future before that financial window closes on them. And that's where everything starts to shift. Because when you're operating under that kind of pressure, you don't spread reps across 3 or 4 players. You don't invest time equally across the board. You narrow your focus. You identify who fits your timeline and who doesn't. And that's exactly what seems to be happening here. The attention moves toward players who represent the future. The conversation centers around those who can realistically take over when the Watson era ends, and anyone who doesn't fit that vision, they get left behind. Not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly. Which brings this right back to Dillon Gabriel. Because when you look at his situation through this lens, it stops being confusing. It starts being logical. He's not the high-investment player the team is financially tied to. He's not the clear future they're actively building toward. He doesn't solve the timeline problem the Browns are trying to fix. He sits in the middle. And in the NFL, the middle is a dangerous place to be. Because when teams are forced to make sharp decisions, those middle ground players are usually the first to go. Not because they're bad, not because they failed, but because they don't fit what comes next. And once that realization sets in, it becomes clear this wasn't about performance. It was about alignment. And right now, Dillon Gabriel simply doesn't align with where the Browns are headed. But that still leaves one big question unanswered. If he doesn't fit the plan anymore, where does he go next? At this point, it's easy to assume this situation is about performance. But it's not that simple. Because when you look closely at what the Cleveland Browns are actually building, the real issue with Dillon Gabriel isn't what he's done. It's what he represents. And more importantly, what he doesn't. Because right now, Cleveland isn't just evaluating quarterbacks. They're trying to define their identity moving forward. They're trying to answer a much bigger question than who plays next season. They're asking, what does this offense look like in 2 or 3 years? And once you shift the focus to that timeline, everything changes. On one side, you have Deshaun Watson. He represents the past investment, the contract, the commitment the franchise has already made. Whether it's working or not, his presence is tied to what the Browns have already spent years trying to build. Then there's Shedeur Sanders. He represents the future, the upside, the direction the team could move toward if they decide to reset and build around a younger, more flexible option. 2 very different timelines. 2 very different purposes. But both of them serve a role. Now look at where Gabriel fits into that. Or more accurately, where he doesn't. Because he's not the established investment the team is committed to protecting, and he's not the high-upside future they're actively shaping the offense around. He sits in between. And that's the problem. Because in today's NFL, especially at quarterback, being in between doesn't hold value for long. Teams aren't looking for middle ground answers anymore. They're looking for clarity. They're looking for direction. They're looking for players who either anchor the present or define the future. And if you don't clearly do one of those 2 things, you become replaceable. That's the reality Gabriel is facing right now. It's not that he can't play. It's not that he hasn't shown flashes. It's that his skill set, his timeline, and his role don't solve the specific problem Cleveland is trying to fix. Because the Browns don't need another maybe. They don't need another developmental piece who might turn into something over time. They don't have that luxury anymore, not with the financial pressure, not with the expectations, and not with the urgency surrounding the position. They need answers. And they need them fast. Which is why the focus has shifted so aggressively toward players who can either take control now or clearly grow into that role soon. And when that shift happens, players like Gabriel get squeezed out. Not because they did something wrong, but because they don't move the situation forward. They don't change the equation. They don't force a decision. And in a quarterback room that's about to become one of the most competitive and most scrutinized in the league that matters. Because once a team starts narrowing its vision, there's no room left for uncertainty. There's no room left for players who don't clearly fit the direction. And that's exactly what this feels like. Dillon Gabriel didn't fall off. He got left behind. And once a quarterback reaches that point inside an organization, the next step usually isn't development. It's movement, which leads to the next phase of this story. Because if Cleveland has already moved on internally, the only question left is, who's willing to take a chance on him next? At some point, every quarterback crosses an invisible line. Not publicly, not officially, but internally. And once they cross it, everything changes. That's exactly where Dillon Gabriel is right now. Because he's no longer being evaluated as part of the future of the Cleveland Browns. He's being evaluated as an asset. And that's a completely different conversation. When a quarterback shifts from developmental piece to movable piece, the focus stops being about growth and opportunity. It becomes about value, timing, fit. It becomes about what you can get in return. And based on multiple reports and league speculation, that shift may have already happened behind the scenes. Some insiders suggest Cleveland is open to moving Gabriel, not aggressively shopping him, but listening, quietly, strategically, waiting for the right offer instead of forcing a deal. And that tells you everything. Because teams don't listen on quarterbacks they believe in long-term. They listen on players they've already moved past. Now here where it gets interesting. Despite everything happening in Cleveland, Gabriel still has value around the league. Not as a franchise-changing starter. Not as a headline acquisition. But as something every team quietly needs. Stability. A low-risk, cost-controlled quarterback who can step in if needed. Someone who understands systems, can manage games, and won't completely derail an offense if things go sideways. And in today's NFL, that role matters more than people think. Because injuries happen, seasons shift fast, and having a reliable backup can be the difference between staying competitive or watching everything collapse. That's where Gabriel fits. And that's why there's a market. Some projections place his trade value somewhere in the mid to late rounds, possibly a 5th or 6th round pick. It's not blockbuster territory, but it's far from meaningless. It's active value. It's interest. And it's just enough to make a deal worth exploring. Now where could he land? That's where things shift from information to speculation. Some fans believe teams like Atlanta Falcons could make sense, especially given their current quarterback dynamics. The idea of adding a backup who fits certain system traits has come up in discussions, though nothing has been confirmed. Others have pointed toward organizations like Philadelphia Eagles or Indianapolis Colts, teams that have dealt with quarterback depth concerns in recent seasons. Again, nothing official. But the logic is there. Because at this stage, Gabriel isn't being viewed as someone to build around. He's being viewed as someone who can fit into an existing structure. And once that becomes your market, the outcome is usually predictable. It's no longer about if a move happens. It's about when the right situation lines up. When the right team sees enough value. When the right offer meets Cleveland's timeline. Because holding onto him doesn't really serve a purpose anymore, not with the direction the Browns are heading. And not with the changes clearly coming next. And that's the key detail most people are missing. Moving Dillon Gabriel isn't the headline. It's the setup. Because teams don't quietly move on from quarterbacks unless they're making room for something else. Something bigger. Something more aligned with where they're going. And if that's true in Cleveland, then the real story isn't who's leaving. It's who's about to walk through that door next. By now, one thing should be clear. If the Cleveland Browns are moving on from Dillon Gabriel, they're not doing it just to clear space. They're doing it because something else is coming. Because in the NFL, teams don't quietly remove quarterbacks from the equation unless they already have a plan, or at the very least, a very strong idea of what they want to do next. And right now, all signs point to Cleveland preparing for a much bigger move. Not a depth addition, not a safe backup, a real shakeup. Because one of the biggest issues the Browns faced last season wasn't just performance, it was confusion. Too many voices in the quarterback room. Too many mixed signals. Too many unclear roles. It created a situation where nobody truly had control, and when that happens at quarterback, everything else starts to break down. So this time, they're doing the opposite. They're simplifying. They're narrowing the focus. And they're preparing to bring in someone who can immediately change the dynamic the moment they step into the building. That's where the rumors start to get interesting. Because one name that keeps circulating in league discussions is Justin Fields. Now, to be clear, nothing is confirmed. But reports suggest the Browns have at least explored the idea, and the fit is intriguing enough that it hasn't gone away. Because Fields represents something completely different from what Cleveland has had. Mobility, playmaking outside structure, the ability to extend plays when protection breaks down. And in today's NFL, that kind of skill set isn't just valuable, it's becoming essential. On his best days, Fields has shown he can take over games in ways few quarterbacks can. The inconsistency has always been the concern, but some analysts believe that in the right system, with the right support, there's still another level to unlock. And that's exactly the kind of gamble Cleveland appears to be considering. Not a safe option, not a predictable one, but a move that instantly changes the ceiling of the offense. Because if a player like Fields enters this quarterback room, everything shifts overnight. This is no longer about developing one player quietly in the background. This becomes real competition, real pressure, real consequences. Because now you're not just comparing potential, you're comparing impact. And that brings us to the moment the Browns can't avoid anymore. Shedeur Sanders versus Deshaun Watson. Because underneath all the rumors, all the speculation, and all the quiet roster moves, this is the real decision. On one side you have Sanders, the future possibility, the younger option, the player who represents direction, even if he's not fully proven yet. On the other side you have Watson, the financial commitment, the established name, the player the organization has already invested heavily in, whether it's worked out or not. And if you add a third contender into that mix, someone like Fields, now it's no longer a conversation. It's a pressure cooker. Because suddenly every rep matters. Every throw matters. Every decision carries weight. Sanders has to prove he's ready faster than expected. Watson has to prove he still belongs despite everything working against him. And the new arrival, he's there to capitalize on any hesitation from either side. That's not a developmental setup. That's a situation where the organization is forcing clarity. Forcing a decision they've been delaying for too long. And here where it gets even more complicated. Because publicly, this will still be framed as an open competition. That's how teams operate. They'll talk about fairness, about opportunity, about everyone getting their shot. But internally, there will be a very clear understanding of what each outcome means. If Sanders takes control, it signals a full commitment to the future. If Watson reclaims the role, it delays that transition and keeps the current structure alive a little longer. And if a new quarterback rises to the top, then everything resets in a way nobody fully saw coming. Either way, someone is losing this battle. There's no scenario where all of these paths coexist. And that's why this moment feels different. Because this isn't just about adjusting the quarterback room. This is about defining the identity of the franchise moving forward. And once that decision is made, there's no going back. Strip away all the noise, and this entire situation comes down to one unavoidable reality. The Cleveland Browns are heading toward a decision they can't delay anymore. And at the center of it, Shedeur Sanders versus Deshaun Watson. Everything else, the rumors, the roster moves, the quiet exit of Dillon Gabriel, that's all build-up. This is the real story. Because for the Browns, this isn't just about choosing a quarterback. It's about choosing a direction. On one side you have Watson, the investment, The expectation. The past few years of commitment wrapped into one player. His presence in Cleveland isn't just about football, it's about everything the organization has already poured into making this work. The contract, the time, the belief that at some point it would all come together. And even now, despite inconsistency, despite questions, despite the growing pressure, he's still there. Still part of the equation. Because moving on from something that big, it's never simple. It's never clean. And it's definitely not quick. But on the other side, there's Sanders. And he represents something entirely different. Not certainty. Not proven dominance. But direction. He's younger, more flexible, more aligned with where modern offenses are heading. A quarterback who gives you the ability to reset not just the position but the identity of the entire team. And that's what makes this decision so complicated. Because this isn't a clear-cut situation. Watson gives you experience, but comes with baggage in terms of performance expectations and financial weight. Sanders gives you potential, but comes with risk, uncertainty, and the reality that he hasn't fully proven it at the NFL level yet. So what do you choose? Stability or evolution? Commitment or change? And that's the tension building inside Cleveland right now. Because you can't fully commit to both. At some point, one path has to take priority. And once that happens, everything else falls into place. But here, where things get even more intense. Because if the Browns bring in another quarterback, someone like Justin Fields, as some rumors suggest, this stops being a two-player decision. It becomes a three-way battle. And that changes everything. Now it's not just about Watson proving he can still be the guy. It's not just about Sanders proving he's ready sooner than expected. It's about competition at a level where no one is safe. Every rep becomes a statement. Every mistake gets magnified. Every moment gets evaluated. Because when you have multiple viable options in the same room, the margin for error disappears. And in that kind of environment, decisions come fast. Sometimes brutally fast. But here's the part that makes this situation even more revealing. Publicly, the Browns will keep calling this an open competition. They'll talk about fairness, about giving everyone a chance, about letting performance decide. But internally, there's always a preferred outcome. There's always a direction the organization is leaning toward. And the way they've handled everything so far, the shifting attention, the quiet roster moves, the gradual narrowing of focus, it suggests that direction may already be forming. Because teams don't create this kind of pressure unless they're ready to force clarity. They don't restructure the room, move pieces out, and explore aggressive options unless they know a decision is coming. And when that decision arrives, it won't just define the quarterback position. It will define the Browns' future. Because if they choose Sanders, they're committing to a reset, a new timeline, a new identity built around youth and development. If they stick with Watson, they're doubling down on the past, trying to extract value from what they've already invested, even if it means delaying a full transition. And if a new quarterback rises above both, then everything changes in a way nobody fully expected. Either way, someone loses. There's no clean resolution here. No scenario where everyone fits. No outcome where all paths stay open. That's why this moment feels different. Because for the first time in a long time, the Browns can't avoid the decision anymore. They can't hide behind uncertainty. They can't stretch the timeline any further. The pressure has built to a point where something has to give. And when it does, it won't feel like a surprise. It'll feel like confirmation. Confirmation of what the Browns have been quietly signaling this entire time. That this wasn't about finding options. It was about choosing one. And once that choice is made, it won't just end the conversation. It'll start a completely new one. At this point, it doesn't look accidental anymore. It looks planned. Every move, every shift, every silence coming out of the Cleveland Browns building starts to line up when you step back and see the full picture. Because this was never just about a quarterback competition. It never was. What fans thought they were watching, a wide-open battle between multiple players, was something very different behind the scenes. This was a transition. A controlled one. A carefully managed shift from one version of the franchise to another. And once you connect the dots, it becomes impossible to ignore. The silence around Dillon Gabriel wasn't random. It was strategic. The constant focus on Deshaun Watson wasn't just media noise. It was necessity. And the growing attention around Shedeur Sanders. That wasn't hype. That was direction. Because NFL teams don't operate in chaos, not at this level. They don't just let situations unfold without a plan, especially at the most important position in sports. They prepare. They evaluate. And most importantly, they decide early. Then everything that follows is about managing how that decision becomes public. That's what this has felt like from the start. Not a real-time competition, but a process of alignment. Slowly shifting attention, gradually shaping the narrative, making sure that when the final move happens, it feels inevitable instead of shocking. Because that's how organizations protect themselves. They don't want backlash. They don't want confusion. They want acceptance. And the easiest way to create that is to let the audience come to the conclusion on their own. That's exactly what's happening here. Because by the time Dillon Gabriel is officially moved, whether it's a late-round trade, a quiet release, or a deal that barely makes headlines, it won't feel like breaking news. It'll feel like confirmation. Confirmation of everything the Browns have been signaling without ever saying out loud. And that's what makes this moment so important. Not because of the player leaving, but because of what the move represents. This is the Browns stepping out of uncertainty. No more juggling timelines. No more pretending multiple paths can coexist. This is a line in the sand. A decision point. A moment where the franchise finally commits to what comes next, even if it means accepting the cost of what came before. Because make no mistake, there is a cost. Moving away from Watson, even partially, comes with financial consequences. Committing to Sanders comes with risk. Bringing in a new contender comes with pressure. There's no easy path here. Only choices. And consequences. But that's the reality of the NFL. You can delay clarity. You can manage optics. You can stretch decisions for as long as possible. But eventually, you have to choose. And everything Cleveland has done, from contract restructures to shifting media narratives to quiet roster moves, has been leading to this exact point. The moment where the quiet signals turn into real action. So when the final move happens, don't look at it as the Browns giving up on a quarterback. Look at it as the Browns revealing what they believed all along. That Dillon Gabriel was never part of the long-term plan. That the competition fans thought they were watching was never truly open. And that this entire situation, every headline, every rumor, every silence, has been part of a much bigger reset happening behind the scenes. Because in the end, this story was never about who's leaving. It was about who they've already chosen. And once that choice becomes official, everything else falls into place. And the real question is, did the Browns just reveal their future? Or are they still hiding one final move nobody sees coming?